You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to another action-packed episode of the B&H Photography Podcast. Today's episode asks the question, when was the last time you touched a photograph? And we'll be talking about what else? Photographic paper. This episode will give you a comprehensive overview of what papers are available for emulsion-based printing as well as inkjet printing at lab or at home. It's sort of a follow-up to our episode from a few weeks ago when we talked about inkjet printers. Questions we will address include what is opacity, what does GSM mean, and why should I be concerned about brighteners? First, a quick plug. We have been adding features to our show, and it's a great time to subscribe to the show on iTunes. Also, visit our new landing page, for which there is a link in the show notes. And while you are there, leave us a voice message. The widget is easily found on the desktop page. And if you scroll down on your mobile device, you will see it. Also, at the end of today's episode, we're going to be offering a promo code for 10% discount on all Canson paper products, of which we offer many. Before we get off in today's topic, Al's Gearhead Pick of the Week. Today, we're going to be talking about a lens I got the other day for reviewing. It's an interesting lens. It's a Mayer Optic Gorlitz Trioplan 100mm f2.8. It's a classic 100-year-old triplet optical design, 3 elements. Goes back over 100 years, made in Germany, 15 aperture blades. And this is the lens that...
15?
15, count them, 1-5. Actually, there are 15 of them with anti-reflective coatings. This is the kind of lens you use if you like what they call bubble bokeh, when all these specular highlights in the background look like Christmas ornaments. It's a really pretty lens, and I've been using it for about 2-3 days now, and it's really interesting. It's not just the specular stuff, but even what it does to backgrounds, very painterly. It's made with a shot glass. It's a great optic. It's built like a tank. And I'm looking forward to trying the rest of their lenses. They're going to be sending us a series of them over the next few weeks. So there you have it. That would be the Mayer Optic Gorlitz Trioplan 100 f2.8. Just saying it makes you sound like you're smart.
The soap bubble bokeh, that's your phrasing? Or that's
No, that's what they call it. Personally,
bubble.
I would never use that phrase, but that's what people are calling it. I would personally call it Christmas ornament spectacular highlights, but that's just me. Now it is showtime. Let's have some proper introductions. Robert Rodriguez Jr. is not only a wonderful landscape photographer, but a printer. And it's no wonder that Canson has chosen him to be an ambassador for their lineup of photographic papers. Robert is also an in-demand photo instructor and author of 3 books, 1 on printing and 2 on the art and craft of photographic seeing. Is that correct to say?
That is.
That's pretty good. Okay, I didn't go to high school for nothing. Also joining us, August Pross is the print manager and co-owner of LTI-Lightside, a full-service photo lab here in New York City. He started as an emulsion-based printer in his native Nova Scotia, and then in Montreal and Vancouver, where he honed his craft, eventually settling in New York City as a color printer, where he has helped to build LTI-Lightside into a premier destination for editorial and fine art, photographic, and inkjet printing. And by the way, that's where I bring my film personally. It's a great lab on
30th Street, right?
East 30th, off Madison Avenue. Mm-hmm. Great place.
Yep.
We were talking about printers a few weeks ago, and we're talking about the great strides that inkjet printing has been making over the years, it's almost 20 years now that we've been doing this. Let's get into what this is about. Where is the future? Is it inkjet paper? Is it traditional darkroom? Is it a combination of the two? Where are we going with this? Where are we?
I think it's definitely inkjet paper. You see so many new products coming out, and the inkjet printers are so much easier to use and maintain. Nobody wants to have a big machine full of chemicals sitting around to process emulsion-based paper.
There's something wonderful about having no chemistry. I have to admit, there really is.
Yeah.
What about all the big tanks of ink sitting around, though? Same.
Well, you can turn that thing off and leave it off all week and come back next Monday and turn it on, and no problem.
Right.
And they don't make your fingertips yellow.
Exactly.
That's really...
No annoying little itch when your hand's in the bleach tank. Yeah.
And our papers, papers are coming out to match this demand, correct? I mean, all
Definitely.
the manufacturers are putting out more and more.
Yeah. And the manufacturers have tried to imitate the best of the emulsion-based papers and some of the more novelty products like the metallic papers or the Fujiflex, which are, like on a plastic substrate and have a very high gloss. Those were are hard to imitate with an inkjet, where you're actually laying ink onto the surface and you're not...
Right. It's not in the emulsion. It's all surface, right?
Yeah. But they're getting better and better. And so the choice you have with inkjet materials is huge. And the manufacturers of the emulsion-based are pulling back and limiting their product line until they have like a couple of high-end professional-grade papers that have high silver content. So you have a good D-Max, a good black point. And then you have like commercial papers, which you would see in a mini lab environment, which are cheaper and easier to make. And so there's only a few choices now with emulsion-based papers. This is all color. Black and white is a different world where you still have Ilford and Oriental and other, legacy brands.
Are these manufacturers sticking with it? I mean, it seems to me right now that they're committed to continuing this. Do you hear any little murmurings that, something that you really like right now as far as a paper is kind of threatened?
I think for darkroom papers, the black and white people are very committed, and they're going to be around for a long time. The two main color papers, Fuji and Kodak, those are big companies, and they make decisions based on their bottom line, and it takes a huge volume to manufacture it. It's a very sensitive manufacturing process.
And you don't have Hollywood clout to make a phone call to Kodak saying, listen, we need this film stock to go for another 20 years,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. So when the market shifts away from emulsion-based, they'll shift with it.
Do you think there'll be any boutique labs, not labs, but manufacturers? Like right now we're starting to see some of the old film manufacturing plants in Europe are being brought back to life. Do you think anything like would happen for color paper if this was come to pass?
Yeah, I'm no expert.
I know you wanted to, but
I wanted to, but I'm a little bit cynical, and I would have to say that you just need to make so much of it, and it's a perishable product. Where they make it in these master rolls and they put it in a salt mine somewhere and they cut it as they need it. But once it's like a year or 18 months old, that master roll, they have to throw it away and start over.
True.
And nobody wants to sit on that kind of inventory and a boutique person making it, like, do they have a salt mine?
There are lunatics out there.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? The salt mine and the storage of this paper?
That could be a hearsay from my Kodak rep, okay. But that's what I was told, is that somehow there's a salt mine and it blocks the gamma radiation, which causes the paper to yellow over time.
Interesting.
I wrote that as a joke.
Full circle.
Somebody bought that?
Yeah.
That was from last April 1st. I don't... Okay.
But do the major, let's say the Fuji and the Kodak, are they growing in their inkjet line and their digital paper lines, or not really?
Kodak really tried, and like a lot of things that Kodak tries to do, they bought a bunch of royalties and licenses, and they stuck their brand on it, and they made what seemed to me to be a bit of a half-hearted attempt to market it. But I'm a very small part of their world, so I feel like they didn't get much response, and they've already moved on. And now Kodak is, I think it's sort of two companies. I can't really say what they are, but
I think it's more than two companies already. Just whatever's being licensed at the moment.
And one of those, the bigger one, is more concerned with like the press industry. And as the guy said to me a while ago, like Kodak are experts at coating things. And so if you need a coating, you can call Kodak.
Kodak. That's what they know. Roberto, first question for you. Everything you're doing right now is inkjet. Is that a safe assumption? Did you start off doing chemical darkroom? Traditional?
No, I started printing right from digital.
Okay.
Yeah, so that, most of my career has been with digital photography.
Right.
So I did a little bit of film work, but I wasn't printing at the time. I didn't get serious about photography until I started with digital, and that's when I started printing right away. So it's always been with digital printers. So I'm almost, I've been there from the very beginning when digital printers weren't as easy, as user-friendly as they are now.
Yeah.
The setup now, going back to your question originally about why would people want to go back to emulsion, the setup, the hardware side of digital printing now is really simple. I mean, there's not much to it.
Yeah.
You hook a couple of things up, you run the software to install it, and that's it. Most of what I have to deal with is the software side and getting the machines to do what you want to do. But the hardware side, there's nothing to it. Like you were saying, I keep it on or turn it off, make sure your inks are charged, and it works pretty well.
What do you use? What's your printer? And do you print everything at home yourself?
Yeah, I do everything at home. I have an Epson and Canon, so I try to stay manufacturer agnostic. For instance, Epsons have been notorious for clogging. My first Epson did clog. The last two Epsons that I've had over the last 5 years have never clogged once. I try to maintain. I use them fairly often. A lot of that probably. A little bit, yeah. But I don't think it's. If you run, I tell people all the time, if you run one print a week, that's enough to kind of keep everything flowing, and that's all you need. You don't have to, use them multiple times a day. And so they've really, both manufacturers have worked a lot to make the hardware side, basically, as user friendly as possible.
I want to go back to the Canon Epson question a bit, but just something I'm curious, since you really just got into it all with digital, do you ever get curious about any of the traditional process? Say you have an image that you just love and say, I wonder what this would look like on Ectacolor or whatever the new paper is. I might use a term that's been discontinued for 18 years. I don't know.
Yeah, actually, I've had a couple of my images made using alternative processes through some people that I met at Canson, and they were doing that kind of thing. And I just wanted to get a sense of what that looked like.
Sure.
And of course, it's fabulous. It just extended what I like about prints. Is it just made them that much more fantastic to hold in your hand or to look at. But in terms of the process, unless you're dedicated to that, or you have a particular goal in mind with making alternative process prints, it's so much easier for me to make them on my own digitally.
Some people just like being in dark rooms for long periods of time by themselves.
That's how I got started.
So can I ask, August, about your lab, about LTI? What papers are you using for your emulsion-based work, black and white and color? And then maybe we can go then to talk about
for black and white, we default to Ilford. Ilford resin coated and fiber products. They're great papers. Yeah. The supply is good.
And you buy rolls and cut them yourself, or how's that work?
For black and white, we're still buying cut sheets, and because it's still available. That's the main format. And
it seems to me you'd want to go that route. That's just less handling, right?
Yeah, it just fits.
Unless you're doing
easel.
like murals or something like that.
That's right. And we have a size limit, so we're not printing anything over 20 by 24 black and white in the darkroom. So a cut sheet is easy to use. We have clients who make special requests, and Oriental is another brand that's out there that makes a nice high quality fiber-based paper. So we use that for black and white too. And then on the color side, we use mostly Kodak paper in rolls, and we're printing that on a large format digital printer, Lightjet. So you load in the roll, and it exposes it with a laser, and you unload it at the other end of the machine, and then you put it into a paper processor, which develops it and fixes it and washes it and dries it, and it comes out finished, in 4 minutes. We're doing a little bit of darkroom work still, more contact sheets than anything. People that shoot film, bring it to us to process, and we love film, and we love scanning film and turning it into digital work as well. But the best way to get a read on what you've shot is to get a contact sheet that's made in the darkroom. And so we do a lot of contact sheets actually we use Fuji paper for that, because Kodak at one point changed their formula so that it no longer had the engineering to compensate for the long exposure times in the darkroom.
Oh, so reciprocity became an issue.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And they also, the formula, somehow they did something about the orange mask of the color negative film. It was no longer important for the design of the paper to have a way to compensate for that. And
There seems to be somebody in every single division of Kodak who makes these decisions that ultimately go south.
yeah, it's pretty
Like, who's that
esoteric.
person who said, let's take all of our digital sensor technology and license to our competition?
Yeah.
That's a good idea. I know, it sounds like...
Kodak,
don't get me started.
Me neither. But, and not to get bogged down in the details, but Fuji paid attention to the people shooting film, and their paper is still engineered to expose in the darkroom. So you get better skin tones. The Kodak paper, if you take it into the darkroom, it's got a lot of contrast, a lot of saturation, and skin tones are a little harder to control.
So if somebody comes in with a landscape image to print and somebody comes with a portrait, you might be using or recommending different papers based on that.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And that brings me back to a question I want to go back to you, because you mentioned you use Canon and Epson printers. Will the subject matter determine which printer you're using? Will a landscape or a portrait go through one or the other?
Very rarely. I would say that subject matter almost never comes into the decision between using one printer over the other. It really has to do with format. So they're not exactly the same size. The Canon is a large format that accepts rolls. And the Epson is more of a desktop that just accepts cut sheet.
Gotcha.
And so I might use them, I usually use them more based on that, based on whether I'm printing on a cut sheet or a roll. Other things, for example, on Epson printers, even today, if you want to switch from a gloss paper to a matte paper, you have to switch between two inks. And while you don't have to switch out the cartridges, there's still a time that the printer takes to swap from one to the other. Canon doesn't have that time delay, so sometimes I might be in a rush to get a print done, or I don't want to switch the inks because I got to come back to that printer to print another matte.
And also, whenever you do that swap, you are losing ink. It does
potentially. I'm sure there's something going on there. So again, that might be a decision where I know I have this printer. The Epson is already loaded with a matte black, and so I'll print a photo paper on the Canon, something like that. And of course, size. If I need to print anything larger than 17 by 22, then I have to use the Canon.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
And August, are people still coming in for the standard 4x6 prints and development?
Yeah, like that's what I would call like a mini lab service.
Right.
But what more than anything, the film shooters who are out there, who are often enthusiasts and students and just people that love film, as well as professionals. But mainly now they're interested in getting a scan. So we process the film and then we scan it, the full roll, into like manageable 17 meg files, and we send that to them using like WeTransfer or put it on a
CDs
disc.
Or do you still use CDs?
If someone wants it, but generally people ask for a digital download.
Of course, yeah.
And the 4x6 is like the topic of our show. Like when was the last time you touched a print? The 4x6s have really gone away, and people don't have that physical object, which is
the envelope. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Shoe boxes of prints. That's going to be something of the past. Yeah. It's really funny. We talk about prints, and part of the allure of prints is the fact that they have the tactile experience of it. There's something about looking at a print, especially if it's a fine art paper, has some meat on the bones and texture. Yet you really shouldn't touch prints. That's kind of the funny thing about it. You want to just pick it up and touch it, and they feel great and they're amazing, but you shouldn't do that.
It's something more about that too. That's also just when you just the reflections and kind of trying to find that right angle when you're looking at a print on the wall. And obviously, you guys know much better in terms of trying to get the richest blacks and the contrast, and that's a pretty wonderful experience, I'm sure.
What's the most common size? I'm going to ask both of you. When people come in for prints, what is the average size right now that people are looking at? Is that anything you could figure out on that one?
A lot of people come to us when they can't do it themselves at home.
Which means bigger than a 1319 or bigger. 11 by 14 or something like that, yeah.
But, there's a lot of 11 by 14 or 1319 out there, definitely, 8 by 10 still. But we also do a lot of larger work, 20 by 30, 40 by 50. We have an inkjet printer that can do 60 inches on the short side, and you can make a really big print on that. And a lot of people come to us because they can't do that at home. So that's the niche that we fill.
And are all of the inkjet papers you're using, or can you get the wide range of types of paper for inkjet that you could always get for emulsion based?
Probably wider based, I would say, right?
Nowadays, much
yeah.
wider. Yeah. Although they do kind of break down into a few
Categories.
3 categories, I would say.
Pearl.
What are the 3?
Well, I guess I would label them as the RC type papers, resin coated, which are like a emulsion based color photograph, kind of plasticky feeling.
Yeah.
And then you have the fiber based, the fine art inkjet papers, which are made with either cotton rag or wood pulp, basically. And those fine art ones come in either like a matte or a glossy surface. Like those are the wide ranges. So RC, matte fine art fiber, and glossy fine art fiber are the main categories.
I think there's almost too many papers. Some of the manufacturers are producing 12, 13, 14 different papers. And what I experience anyway doing trade shows is people asking, what are the differences? Why would I use one over the other? They're confused. Or they're looking at what's new, ignoring what's been there already that has worked, but they're kind of overlooking because they think, well, if it's new, it must be better.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are certain advances made with papers, but in general, it's like printers now. Things are kind of leveled off. And paper's been around for a long time. So I think many people should invest more time in just discovering a good paper and getting the most out of it. Similar to lenses, for example, or cameras. Everyone's just looking for the next thing. Meanwhile, they haven't gotten optimized or maximized or learned.
They haven't learned what's already in their bag.
Kind of, sure, exactly.
And
I think another factor that adds a little bit of the confusion too is the fact that you have a lot of what we're calling paper manufacturers. The truth is, there's only like 4 or 5 mills when it comes to fine art paper, especially in the world, and they're selling all this stuff to different distributors who are repackaging and rebranding. So you could have 6 papers on a shelf, and it's the same paper in different packages.
And the manufacturer will tell you that the inkjet coating, the receptor coating.
These are our custom. Yes, the stock, the media is the same, but it has our coatings.
That's
on
right.
It.
Yes, that's how they differentiate.
Yeah.
But
And Robert, what papers have you kind of settled on? What do you use when? I mean, I know it's Canson, but let's say you have a landscape image, or then you have a portrait. What are you choosing? What are you using?
Yeah, so paper selection is something that I talk in my workshops about having a paper-centric approach versus a photo or image-centric approach. And many people start with a paper-centric approach. In other words, I like this paper, I like the way it looks in general, so that's the paper I'm going to buy, and I'm going to use that for all my work. And
it may not be suited for every image.
It may not. And while that may work, I prefer, or my experience has been that I get better results from an image-centric approach. So I look at each image and determine what paper or which paper that I have is going to complement what I'm trying to get across in that picture. And so a part of that is really putting the onus on the artist or the photographer to kind of determine what is it trying to say. And I think that's really key, because then it gives you a better sense of what paper to choose. Now, that's a more difficult way to go. It's harder to go that way because now you have to ask yourself the question, what is this image about? And of course, we know that now we're getting into the aesthetic and the artistry of what an image is. And a lot of people aren't there yet. That's fine.
You also have to understand the characteristics of each paper. Some papers will have better separation of shadow detail or highlight detail.
Of course.
And the image you want to do may not work with that particular paper because it won't translate well.
Sure. Which is why I think it's when you mentioned before about categories, I think it's important to start with, let's say, a paper from each category, because those categories are going to really dictate different ways that the image is going to be interpreted. So matte paper, any matte paper, is going to look very different with the same image than a photo or RC paper will look. Mm-hmm. And that'll start to teach you, or you'll start to learn what it does to the image. And once you get comfortable with that and you can make the decisions based on just those categories, then you can start to dive into each particular category and say, okay, I know this matte paper is best for this image. Now, which matte paper? Do I want some texture? Do I want better shadow separation? Do I want something that's a little more textured and will give me more of a rougher, more of a painterly or watercolor look? Mm-hmm, But you have to start with the basics first. Basics, are really the key, the fundamentals. And the companies, of course, are very good at marketing the next greatest paper, and so you just dive into a paper without knowing, gee, I like that paper, but too much texture, so I don't like that category at all. And you're dismissing the category based on just one test that you've done with a particular paper. So it does require time and investment, and investment in money, which is a lot of people don't want to do.
Nodding his head over here. But so how do you convey some of these decisions to a customer when they come in?
I think that it's like anything where you're thinking about an audience. You got to ask, like, what's it for? Who's your audience? Because there's also some
What's your end
practical
need?
considerations. Like, is it going to go into a portfolio? Is it going to be handed to someone that is going to put their fingers all over it? Because certain papers are durable and certain papers aren't. Is it going to be framed right away? Like,
what kind of glass is it going to be behind?
Exactly. So like, what is your end use? Is a huge part of the conversation, and then you get on to the more subtle parts of the image.
I love if you don't mind, talk some specifics about that. Maybe you can think of some of your images, Robert. Like, let's say we're talking a beautiful fall landscape, and maybe it's too specific. But is there ways that you can kind of determine based on an image what you'll choose?
Yeah, and it's hard to use labels because a foggy landscape could be many different things. Again, it depends, for me anyway, as an artist and as a photographer, it depends on what I'm trying to convey with the image. So as an example, let's say I have a landscape where the whole reason why that I made the picture was because I had a serene experience. I felt something that was just transcendent, and it was something that made me feel very relaxed, right? A high contrast, high gloss paper may not be appropriate because that's going to present a much more literal version of the image to someone. I want a paper that perhaps softens the blacks, that gives more of a sense of a metaphoric or even an analogy of something that I, like Ansel says, a photograph has to be more than what than the image. And vice versa. I may have an image that is very literal, very photographic. I want to present exactly what in the image on paper. I don't want there to be any sort of translation. Or perhaps I have a landscape where I have rich blacks, and those blacks are key to the composition. So I can't let the shadow detail get lost on a matte paper. Then I would go to something that had greater Dmax, that could hold black more, that would separate the shadows and make that part of the composition work, because otherwise the composition breaks down. So, I mean, it's always going to come back for me anyway, back to the picture itself. Right. The picture has to work first before I can even consider it working on a piece of paper.
Can you explain Dmax? Can somebody explain density?
It stands for maximum density, I believe, right?
Yeah, the blackest black you can make.
Okay.
On it, and it's different for every paper
and printer
process.
As well. Because different printers have different Dmax.
That's right. The ink sets, each one has
capabilities. Sure.
A glossy ink will give you better Dmax than a matte ink,
or different printer models. So, for example, every time Epson releases a new printer, they try to increase the Dmax rating, and that's a part of what they market. And many times it is better. They are improving the technology slowly, but it does get better.
Right. Okay, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, more about paper with Robert and August. And we're going to have a 10% discount code for Canson products. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BHPhotoVideo, #BHPhotoPodcast.
Okay, we are back. Let's talk about attributes of papers. There are certain things when you buy inkjet papers, there's a whole little list of things that go along with it that basically identify the paper. Thickness and weight. Let's talk about that. Sometimes I've noticed that you could have papers that are two thicknesses and the weight is different. Right? Am I wrong about that?
I only saw weight.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm more familiar
GSM.
with weight, GSM.
All right, and GSM stands for
Grams per square meter.
Yeah.
okay.
Do we both get
For
that?
$10.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically you have papers. Now some of them are really, really thin. If you need cheap prints, you get the real thin stuff. But then they have thicker papers, and they go up to about 370, 380 gram, which is sort of like blotter paper. Or even 400 plus some
Very
of the numbers,
thick.
or 500. I remember 505 as a top number I've ever seen for thickness of paper, and you could barely bend it. But that is museum quality fine art paper. And then you have photo board, which is available, which is essentially like illustration board that you could print directly onto. I love that. Remember dry mounting? You don't need it anymore. So you have that. Opacity. What is that?
Opacity. Well, before we jump into that, I just want to mention, as far as the weight, again,
Yeah.
I think most papers, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, most papers seem to have averaged out around 310 as far as a maximum weight, and then usually they'll come in half that. So some 180, 200, 220, and then 300, 305, 310. Canson has a 340 paper. Generally, the more weight of the paper per square meter, the thicker it's going to be. That's the only way to get it to be heavier. And I think most fine art photographers are using heavier weight papers. They just feel better.
They also don't ding as easily. They don't bend. Much more durable.
Exactly right. They don't bend as easy. They're more durable. They feel nicer when you matte or frame them. They're more liable to lay flat and keep their form versus buckling. So when anyone asks me, oh, I framed the print and it's buckling, the first thing I ask them is, what weight paper did you use? And if it's 180 or 200, that's the reason why, especially as you get larger.
So you want 300 plus if it's going to be a print that you're going to want to have on your wall for a while or something.
I would, in my opinion,
that's my
yes.
take on it too.
Yeah, I agree.
Opacity?
Okay.
Yeah. Can we go back to that?
Yeah, opacity now. Anybody want to take a shot at that one?
I see it on the tech sheets, and I'm not quite sure what it's talking about. I often wonder, do I put a flashlight behind it and see if I can shine through? Or
Now, for those of you who want to try out our speak pipe gizmo, okay, if you know what it is, call it in.
Yeah.
Yes, totally. Please help us
We'll
out
have you
here.
a guest on the show. We'll have a whole show about opacity. Then you have brightness, too. Now, this is kind of interesting, brightness. And they use phosphorus to get these papers to be whiter looking, brighter, which for brighter highlights. But there's a problem with that, too, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's been an issue of contention for a long time. Manufacturers claiming that either they don't use OBAs or that's the
optical brightening
agents that they put into the papers to make them appear whiter. And if you have a higher white point, then your paper is going to have more contrast, right?
Yeah.
Because you've got more separation between whites and blacks. Then there are the purists that want to use or don't want to have any papers that have OBAs in them because OBAs fade over time. That's the idea. And if they fade, then you will compromise the integrity of the print. So, and the other thing also is our eyes are really good at adapting and modifying what we see. So if you compare a paper that's whiter to a paper that's not as white, or a paper that has OBAs in it, of course it's going to look whiter. But as soon as you take either paper away,
it looks great.
It looks great because your eye will adapt and recalibrate itself.
I think the big thing is if you have a print and you want it to last for whatever forever is, you don't want too many brighteners in it because the brighter it is, the shorter the life, because that phosphorus actually eats away the paper base.
If any at all, right?
Yeah.
If any at all, so.
Yeah, okay. And that's why some of these papers, they have what they call natural. It's sort of like a buff or a bone color, like off-white. That means there's no brighteners in it. So it's theoretically, it'll last longer.
The papers with the brighteners tend to go towards the blue side. So if you're comparing two and you notice one is like a little cooler and the other's a warmer white, then one probably has more brighteners than the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you need a couple of UV filters to
or a UV light,
a UV flashlight.
Yeah.
Instant drying. Now I'm assuming that means that it's going to be an RC, a resin coated paper. Because I don't think. Am I right or wrong? I'm wrong about that.
The fiber-based papers come out of the printer dry to the touch.
They're all instant drying. Yeah.
Yeah, they all are.
Okay. All right.
And we're talking now inkjet. And when you say dry, I mean the ink itself is dried into the paper.
So that's an ink
soaks in. Right?
That's an ink attribute more than a paper attribute. Then, am I right or wrong about that?
I would say it's a
one?
combination of both. Probably the coating as well as the ink. The better they're optimized to dry, they dry pretty quickly. The one caveat to that is that even though they do dry, or they come out of the printer dry, there is the outgassing part, which that's not ink drying, but you do have to let it outgas for a period of 24 to 48 hours.
That's an important point, and that's something that I think anybody who's going to be doing inkjet printing has to understand. Even if you have a print that comes out dry to the touch, you have to let it sit for at least 24 hours because there's a lot of stuff going on in the ink itself. It keeps releasing. As it dries, it's releasing gases and all kinds of stuff.
Sure.
And it's not unusual if you were to take a print and even wait like 10, 15 minutes and then frame it, put it behind glass, the next day you're going to probably notice a white haze over the image, and that's the residue coming out of it. So you have to let the whole thing go.
And I do know a photographer who actually has a reptile lamp. So the lights that you buy for a reptile, because that will speed up the process by about a factor of 2 times. So she will put her prints underneath this reptile lamp so she can frame them that same day because she's in a rush. And that'll make them outgas faster.
I heard a nightmare story where somebody printed up a portfolio that was sold for a lot of money, and they shipped it in a case. All right, they had all the prints. They did everything they were supposed to do. They shipped them in a case that was sealed, and it had some kind of a foam padding in it. And between the gassing of the foam that was in this sealed box and the outgassing of the prints, the next day when it showed up to the gallery to be sold to the client, okay, they opened it up and all the images had these green and magenta casts all over them, as if somebody took bleach and just shook it around inside of the thing, and they trashed the whole portfolio. So outgassing and drying is a real important thing. Archival longevity is the whole thing about this. It used to be that, and we talked about this when we did our printer show, that if you made an Epson, especially a glossy print, and you stuck it onto your refrigerator door, you could actually watch it fade. You could set your watch, and within 3 hours, it's gone. We've come a long way since then. By the way, they look great for the first 3 or 4 minutes, those prints. But we've come a long way, and prints really do last a long time. And I think it's fair to say that any print that we put out, and this could be conventional or inkjet, if it's stored properly or framed properly and hung in an area where it's not getting hit by direct sunlight or fluorescent lamps or other high UV light source or high humidity, it's going to last 50, 60, 70, 80 years before noticeable fading may occur. And depending if it's a monochrome, it could last 200 or more years. So is that pretty fair? Is there any papers that you find that are still like you just don't want to go near them?
I don't. And I will say, if you look up Wilhelm Research,
yes,
at least for Canson's papers, for example, you're seeing if you protect them, because the two key detriments are UV light, as you mentioned, and ozone.
Yes.
And so if you put the prints in a box or put them behind a UV glass, you're not protecting them from UV light and ozone. And for almost all of Canson's papers, they're over 200 years now, which is incredible longevity. And these are inkjet prints on matte or fiber surfaces. The only exception to that is baryta, which has some optical brighteners in the baryta coating itself in the barium sulfate. So they don't add the optical brightener to make the paper whiter. It's just the nature of the coating. But even that paper is now up to, last I checked, maybe 150 years if it's protected again in a box or something. So I think those rating estimates are far beyond anything with a traditional darkroom print. No.
Well, definitely for color materials.
Color, yes, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, if anybody wants to look a little bit more into this, Henry Wilhelm,
Yes,
he had Wilhelm Labs. He's been around as long as inkjet has been around, probably longer than that, but that's where I first caught on to him. He basically will take all of the papers. He's paid to do this by manufacturers. He's considered a really straight, unbiased guy. His lab will test different paper ink combinations under accelerated aging using heat and whatever they do to accelerate the stuff. And they come up with what are considered very accurate predictions of how long a print should last before it starts to noticeably fade under, and they give you the parameters of storage or framing.
Right.
And that's a good reference point, but we're at a place right now where stuff really does last. So they are good. Then there's gloss levels that we have here, and we talked about that briefly. You got glossy paper, there's all different services.
Yeah.
There's millions of them.
What do you guys offer over at LTI? I mean, you have obviously glossy and matte, but
the range is between like the super high gloss, like Fujiflex type papers, which are like plastic. You know, they're so shiny, it's like looking at a piece of plexiglass. And then for inkjet materials, you get down into like what are called glossy, but they're more like a traditional black and white fiber print that was air dried. And so air dried glossy, it's shiny, but it's got a little bit of surface texture to it, and it's not like a hard plastic surface. And then you can go down to matte.
Is anybody ferrotyping anymore?
I don't think they are.
And then we have sizes. They're all over the place. Everything from little 4x6s up to, I don't know, 60-inch rolls and more if you're going to an industrial stuff. That's, you know. And we're talking about inkjet and traditional, but there are other printing techniques too. There are oil-based printers for billboards, and there's some pretty esoteric stuff out there. But if somebody came into your facility and said, we're going to be doing this thing, it's going to be a monster-sized print and has to hang on the side of a highway for 6 years.
We're not the place for that.
That's signage.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's okay. All right. But however, we're talking about there are media that use like petroleum-based inks that will do all this stuff, but we're not going to go there.
There's also other media, for example. I've used something called Phototex. You ever heard of that?
Is it like a fabric that?
It's kind of like a fabric, but what's interesting about it is that it's a wallpaper medium, and so it comes on a roll. You print on it, and then it has an adhesive backing, and you pull that backing off, and it'll stick onto the wall like wallpaper. And it looks pretty good. And the thing is, when you take it off, it doesn't tear off the paint behind it. And if you, let's say you have a big image and you kind of lay it, print it out in sections, you can cover a whole wall. So you can make murals. And I've done that for, like, my son's room has like a giant mural of a racing car or something because he convinced me to spend a lot of ink to print up this mural for his wall.
And you're a good dad, so it's not an issue. That's an important thing.
Yeah.
You want to talk about profiles a bit?
Yeah, well, during our break, we talked about profiles, and that's a really important thing. And just to back up, a profile basically is if you have an Epson printer and you buy Epson paper, and when you set up your printer menu and you tell the printer what paper you're using, theoretically, your print should come out very accurate. And also, we have to qualify this. If you did not calibrate your monitor before doing a printing session, if you've never calibrated your printer, or it's been 6 months since you've done it,
Good luck.
Good luck, because you're going to say that the printer's terrible because it doesn't look like what's on the screen. The problem is that what's on the screen is not accurate. So the first thing you have to do is calibrate your monitor, because if what you're looking at isn't accurate, nothing's going to be accurate. Once that's there, if you're using from the same printer and paper manufacturer, like Epson printers, Epson paper, Canon printers, and you match them properly, use the profile, then you're going to have good results. Now, it gets tricky when you go to third-party papers, because not every manufacturer makes a printer. There's only 2 or 3 that are. And that's when you have to download from the manufacturer the profile, which determines not only the color balance, but even how fast the paper goes through the printer, because different ink sets, when used with different papers, require different dry times between each pass. So if you're using different papers with your printer, you might notice that some prints come through quicker than others. That's because they need more dry time between each pass. Otherwise, nothing works out really, really well. So profiles are pretty complex. You want to give us some thoughts about those?
Yeah, so first I would resist your idea that you're more probable to get a better print using an Epson paper and an Epson printer. The only advantage you have from using an Epson paper is that the profiles are installed automatically when you buy the printer. However, once you're in the printing process, let's say you're using Lightroom to print or Photoshop, you still have to select the right profile.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and so
yes.
the selection of the profile is going to be the same whether you're selecting an Epson profile or a Canson or a Hahnemuhle profile.
That's assuming you're not going into the idiot mode on your printer. Some people just want to go, do you want the simple or advanced? No, please sample. If you're doing that, you don't have those options. Then you really have to stick to what you're doing. So let's qualify that. Yeah,
sure. So that, of course. But otherwise, you still have to set up the workflow, if you will, the proper way. I like to describe profiles sort of like translators between different devices that use different languages. So your camera uses one language to describe color. The paper printer, but really it's the paper, uses a different language to describe the same color. The monitor uses a different language to describe color. And the ICC profile is sort of the universal translator between each device, so that the red that you actually see in the field and your camera captured is the red that you get on paper, the same red. Yeah. And if your monitor is not calibrated or you have the wrong profile, then that red may shift. And that's when, of course, you say, oh, the colors are off or the colors are wrong, or sometimes they're just horribly wrong.
Well, my printer's terrible.
Or my printer's terrible.
And how does that work in the lab setting? I mean, are you making adjustments constantly based on the customer's request? Or?
Well, we have a core selection of papers that we use all the time, and we go to the effort to make our own profiles because the profile describes how our specific printer prints on this specific paper, and we set up the parameters of how fast the printer's running and all that kind of stuff. So we want to control it as much as we can, and we build our own. But one point I would like to make about profiles that I'm often saying to customers, you can calibrate your monitor, but what you have to think about is what color light are you looking at your print under?
Mm-hmm.
Your monitor setup is really dictated by your viewing setup. And if you're in a situation where you're beside a window, your light is changing throughout the day, and then at night you're turning on a lamp. Like, no one monitor calibration can tell you what your print is going to look like under all those different situations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right about that. That's another one of the complaints, or one of the things that I try to explain is it's two completely different mediums, a monitor versus a print. And the viewing environments have to match up somehow. And you could say that it's almost impossible to match them up. So, you know, the goal for me anyway is not to get a print. I don't feel successful when I make a print and I say, wow, this print matches my monitor, therefore I'm successful. The goal for me is to look at the print and say, this is exactly what I want the print to look like. Yeah. And so that's what I strive for. Now, of course, the more it matches, the easier it is for me to make adjustments. But ultimately, I want to produce the best looking print, monitor be damned, right? That's what I want.
Yeah.
And I think too many people get wrapped up in this, does it match, does it not match? No, does it look great? Does it look good under different lighting situations?
That was the same thing I always dealt with using, you know, in slides. When you look at your slides back in the day and, you know, the saturation is there and it's beautiful, it's perfect. And then you get the print and you're like, wait, that doesn't look like the slide that I took.
Yeah, what was
Right.
So that, and I think if you want, if perfection is what you're after, then the only way you can really do that is you have to have your monitor calibrated all the time. And whenever you're viewing your prints, you have to do it in a workstation or a light booth that has daylight balanced in it, daylight balanced tubes, which they make, and you can spend a lot of money for them. But a viewing station, the light box should be daylight balanced. But probably the best thing you can do is if you're making a print to hang in a particular space in your home or office, is to make a print and then view that print in that space before you make any final decisions about how you might want to warm it, tweak it, or whatever. Wow. And just be aware that, you know, if there's windows in that room, it's going to change day by day. So it's ballpark.
You know, given my feeling that perfection is the opposite of good, right? How do you deal with artists, let's say? Are some of them, I'm sure there's a wide variety, but do some people ask you to redo and redo and redo? Does that happen a lot? And how do you deal with it?
Well, it does. And, you know, our workflow is not so different from the darkroom because, you know, we do judge the print. We want the print to be the best print it can be. And, like, you can do all the Photoshop work on your monitor in the world and then make a proof, you know, and then we'll look at that and we'll say, okay, well, this red isn't rendering the way it does on the monitor, so we've got to adjust the file accordingly. And so it's just like printing where you make a test print, you look at it, you go back, you make a change. There's a lot fewer iterations with digital printing, but we're still doing that. And so when a client comes and says, you know, it's not right, you know, I don't care what it looks like on the monitor, you got to change it in the print.
And there's also something else we always have to keep in mind. Modern monitors, today's monitors, can reproduce more colors than we can perceive. Yeah. And yet the best printers and ink and paper combinations produce less color and tonality than we can perceive. So you got something that's beyond what we do, and the end result is going to be less than we could see. So it's a compromise.
Yeah, and I also think that, and this is maybe more of a philosophical approach to it, but if you're going through the effort, the time, the investment, the effort to make prints, then you should at least allow them to be something different than what the digital medium is. So I want the print to almost take on its own life, if you will. And if I'm constantly matching it to my monitor, it's almost like I'm not letting it become something separate from what that is. So
it'll never match your monitor, ever.
Right, and in a way, I don't care. I want this to be something that I can say, this is why I print. This is why I print, because I want something that goes beyond what I have on my monitor, because now you're adding the physical attributes, the way the light bounces off it, the way it feels in your hand, the way I respond to it, which you don't get on a digital device. There's just something missing there for me.
Well, at the same time, when you saw the scene that you're about to photograph, what you saw is never going to come off in the digital file or the print because that's the real deal.
Sure.
And how you're just simulating it using
sure.
other mediums. So it's never going to be the same.
Sure.
It
No,
just has to be really nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has to have something, though. It has to have something
Yes.
that brings you to what that original inspiration was. And
Within the parameters of whatever the medium is.
of course, exactly. Yeah.
I would like to just say, I love prints and the physical object holding it, and whether it's ink on paper or it's a photograph, emulsion-based, like you can really make beautiful stuff that is a tangible object. But so many people are looking at stuff on a screen first, and so many people fall in love with what they see first. They always want to get back to that initial response that they had.
That's a good point.
And like an iPhone has a beautiful screen. And we get beat up all the time. Like, see it, just make it look like this.
Do people do that? They hold up their phone and say,
hold up
"Look
their
at
phone." We're like, yeah, but this is a piece of paper, not a glowing device.
So going to that, can you kind of give us a breakdown of what you do offer? What are the brands that you have, and how do you put them in a hierarchy when you're dealing with clients?
Sure.
Also, do you have a thing where if somebody shows you on the phone, you can actually give them a print that has a big overlay on it with big fingerprints on it?
A cracked screen, motif. We print on a wide variety of media, but the main ones that we go back to over and over are Hahnemuhle products, Epson products, and Canson products on the inkjet side, and then Kodak and Fuji and Ilford on the emulsion-based side.
In talking inkjet, between the Hahnemuhle and Canson and Epson, is there one that you would prefer when we're talking, something that's a thicker fiber-based compared to an RC, or they all kind of match up quality-wise in your sense?
The RC papers, I would say, are a lower quality, but they're totally appropriate for portfolios. And the fact that they're lighter and thinner make them much easier to put them in a book. If you're trying to make a book of prints that are all on a heavy, like 300 GSM paper, that book gets heavy and thick and unwieldy really fast. And there are specific like RC type papers out there that are made to be thin and easy to
and the color is very high fidelity for their purpose. They're actually they're the best choice.
That's right.
You're not going to hang it on the wall of your beach house, perhaps, but because no, that's not what it's for.
And they all offer kind of the same range of types of paper between those brands.
Well, Hahnemuhle and Canson are much more aimed at the fine art market. Canson actually has a large RC range. Hahnemuhle is much more fine art, cotton rag type papers. Epson does everything, and there's different applications for everything. If a photographer comes in and says, this story is going to be printed in a magazine, I need an inkjet print that will replicate the way it's going to reproduce on the press and in the magazine, then you're using an RC type lightweight, proofing paper.
And in terms of black and white digital or inkjet, do you have a preference, or how do you direct people?
People tend to tell us what they want, and often it comes down to like a tactile thing. Like for fine art, usually black and white would be a fine art customer, and they pick it up, and different papers seem very similar according to the tech specs, but they have slightly different texture. And people will look at it and they will immediately put it down, like, I don't want that, and then you show them another one that is virtually the same but has a slightly different finish on it, and they'll be like, oh yes, this looks better.
And ultimately, it's going to be behind a frame, behind glass. You're never going to be able to tell the difference between the two of them. Seriously.
Exactly.
Seriously, it's a funny thing about it.
But the more expensive papers are lovely to hold. You just your fingertips on the back side of it. You can tell that it's made out of cotton or, it's really, a beautiful object.
It really does come down to a lot of what the show's about, the touching of it, right?
Yeah. And remember, don't touch your prints.
Wear gloves.
Just on the back.
Gloves, that's right.
Okay, so Robert, in terms of Canson offerings, what do you tend to use, and give us kind of a breakdown from high to low.
Yeah, so for me, again, I tend to use the fine art papers. I like the heavier cotton rag papers and the wood pulp or alpha cellulose papers. I'm looking for something that is going to be museum quality, something that I'm going to sell or hang or display in a gallery. So I like the richer fine art papers versus the RC papers. The RC papers are great. for running proofs and things like that.
Will you proof on an RC paper, then you'll later print it on a...
I don't, because because I think the difference in the...
Two different looks.
Yeah, two different look. The difference in the surface textures, and I need to have it on the actual paper itself to tell whether it's working for me or not. But yeah, so Canson has a really nice range of matte papers, everything from super smooth to something that has some texture or more texture, and then they've got really nice fiber papers like Platine or Baryta, which are very popular. They just released a Baryta Prestige, which is 340 grams heavier, more resistant to curl, so it lays flatter. And one thing about Canson papers is that none of their fine art papers use optical brighteners at all. So with the exception of the Baryta, which is just part of the barium sulfate. So if they really try, I think their mentality is to be as ideal as possible about producing the best quality museum-grade paper, something that's going to last for a long time. And, one of the things that I enjoy about printing is this idea of, you mentioned before the shoebox and how that's a thing of the past. But actually, I think it's more important than ever, because we now have prints that won't be as fragile as they're much more resistant to damage. So I can hand my son a box of my prints, and not just my own fine art prints, but prints of family, whatever, on really nice paper. And if he takes care of it, that'll last 200 years. That's more than I can say about my hard drives or the cloud service that I'm using to hold my images.
Oh yeah.
So in a sense, I think it's a lot of people say, well, I'm only going to live for another 20 years. That might be true, but if you take any pride in your work, you want it to last so that someone can look back at it and say, hey, look at these beautiful prints, because that's going to be the thing that I think defines a photograph the most, is not how it looks on screen, but something you can pass around. That's what we like most about passing around our pictures. So.
I reflect on that a lot, and that is that, look, I shoot digital just about every day. I love digital. And I love adjusting stuff on the screen and zooming in and playing around and doing all this stuff. And digital imaging is just amazing. It's magic. But you pull the plug and it's gone.
Right.
And I always try to remind myself about that it can go away so easy and be lost. Whereas that print, okay, yeah, you could spill things on it. It can burn. It can get thrown out with the trash by accident. A lot of things can happen, okay? But it's there and it's physical and you can hold it. It's a beautiful thing. All right. Well, great show we've had here. Okay, Robert, for our listeners who would like to see more of your work and see what you're up to, where should they go?
Sure. You can visit my website and blog at robertrodriguezjr.com.
robertrodriguezjr.com.
Yes. Or
we'll link everything in the show notes.
Any Google search will get you there. You can read more about, you can read my blog where I write often about printing and papers and photography in general, and also you can find my workshops there.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have one coming up?
Yeah, actually, we'll have a printing workshop coming up next week, actually. Okay. But the printing workshops, believe it or not, are my most popular offering. So these things sell out way in advance. All the workshops are sold out till like September.
And where do you hold them? Up?
In my studio. So I take 5 students at a time, and we spend 3 days going through the whole process of printing, from evaluating prints and looking at prints to the aesthetics of prints. I say over and over again that the most important factor in making a good print is a good photograph. And that's a key thing, because that's what you're putting on the paper. You have to start with good data, good information, good composition. And then we cover, printers and papers and editing properly and the whole gamut. And people seem to be gravitating towards that now.
Okay, great. And August, LTI-Lightside is located where?
We're at 34 East 30th on between Park Avenue South and Madison, right in the middle of Midtown.
And as I said earlier, it's where I bring all of my film to processing. You guys do good work. You've been there for a while.
Been there a long time.
And it's LTI-Lightside.com?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, and for our listeners interested in some of the finest paper available, we are offering a podcast-exclusive promotion, a 10% discount on all Canson products. This is from March 30th through April 6th. All you have to do is enter the promo code BHCanson. That's BHCAN as in Nancy, SON as in Nancy again, when making your purchase on bnh.com. Again, go to iTunes, subscribe, leave us a review, and go to the link in the show notes and leave us a message on our new landing page. On behalf of John and Jason and myself, thank you so much for joining us today.